Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
The show is a proud media partner for the 11th Annual Media Excellence Awards, which are produced by Access Entertainment in Los Angeles, California. The Media Excellence Awards are recognized as the most influential awards show honoring innovation and leadership in all things mobile entertainment, lifestyle, and technology. For more information on how to submit to these awards, please visit MediaXAwards.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Sean Gourley. He's the CEO and founder at Primer. Sean, welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing? Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think what you guys are doing at Primer is really, really fascinating to me. I think kind of what's happening in kind of globally right now. But maybe before we kind of get into that stuff, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
So the accent you'll hear is if you've got a good ear, you'll pick it's from New Zealand.
Okay, very
and that's
cool.
Where I grew up and spent most of my time. Although I will admit the accent has been modified somewhat over the years on the different places I live. So it sounds somewhat Australian these days, which is I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but definitely
I think it's
from
cool,
New Zealand
man.
originally.
Like that's cool.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. Yeah,
So you went to university. Walk me through what you took and why did you decide to take it?
Yeah, look, so I initially went into university, I guess not really knowing too much of what I wanted to do. So okay. I took early on, I took law, I took mathematics, I took philosophy and physics. I guess I had these sort of images of potentially being a criminal defense lawyer, but I went through that and it turned out that the amount of work that I was doing to get my sort of B+ grade in law was massively more than the work I was doing to get the A+ grades in physics and mathematics. And so at the end of that first year, I sort of took an assessment and thought, man, if I work this hard in physics and maths, as I did in law, I wonder what I would do. But so I ultimately ended up going down the physics and maths road. Just I think I had perhaps a more natural aptitude for it. So ended up doing an undergraduate degree in physics and mathematics, and still kept a side of philosophy, which I found really, really fascinating going through. And so I still kept a little bit of that on the humanities side. Sure.
No, that's great. And you got your PhD, correct?
That's right. So after that, I went through and actually did my master's degree in physics and nanotechnology, and
okay.
And that research there was actually part of the first New Zealand nanotech company, which was ended up getting sold into a Japanese group. So really, really fascinating lab work, kind of sitting down and looking at self-assembled nanowires, and spent a lot of time in a physics lab running experiments. So the empirical side of things was really, really interesting. But after that, I went through and was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford.
Oh,
and,
very cool.
So went over there and got a chance to kind of do my PhD work at Oxford. And I got to Oxford and I sort of looked around and thought, this is too beautiful a place to be stuck in a physics lab. So I started looking for some things that were more computational or more theoretical in nature, and would get me out of the lab. And so I got out of the empirical side of physics and into the computational and simulation side.
Okay, very cool. So walk me through a bit of your career up until kind of founding and becoming CEO of Primer.
Yeah, well, so there was quite instrumental, the PhD work that I ended up doing. So I ended up finding my supervisor there was a guy named Neil Johnson. We ended up working together on a I guess, a lot of work on the mathematical structure of insurgency. So we ended up looking through and taking these reports, written reports of information coming out of places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and looking at the descriptions of these events that were unfolding. These were attacks that were killing people, and you're looking at the timing and the size and the geolocation of these attacks. And so we went through that there and started doing research to see if we could see patterns in the way that violence was unfolding. And so my research was really, really focused on the mathematical structure of insurgency. And it turned out that there were a lot of patterns in the way that violence unfolds. Okay. And not just patterns in violence, but these would repeat themselves across different war zones around the world. We're able to build simulations of these conflicts and actually start to understand how insurgencies are so successful, or why the organizational structures of insurgencies were so successful. And that work caught the eye of the scientific community and ended up being published on the cover of Nature. So it was a huge kind of scientific.
Yeah, that's huge, man. Congrats on that. That's great.
Yeah, that's right. We're thrilled. It's one of those ones that you think it all goes smoothly through that, but after 5 hard years of doing that research, it eventually ended up on the cover, and it was a huge kind of piece of work for me as a PhD student. But more than that, I think it opened up a new field of a really quantitative analysis of conflict, and after that took me around a number of different places around the world, and some very, very interesting experiences in places like the United Nations, and also U.S. Central Command, and also some time up in northern Iraq. And so that was sort of that journey through, and I came through that. And ultimately decided that I wanted to do more than just write papers. I wanted to actually build things, and that's what brought me out to Silicon Valley.
Okay, very cool. So how did you decide to come up with Primer, and what exactly is it?
Yeah, so for me, I became really, really fascinated in around 2013, 2014 of what we were seeing with multi-layer neural networks and what they were doing to images. And they'd really kind of come into the image world and started to kind of, have a significant step change in the performance on some really, really key tasks. So I was looking at that and thinking, well, this, the next step on this is language, and these multi-layer neural nets will go and have a similar effect. Well, that was the bet. That would have a similar effect with understanding language. So for me, coming into Primer, we were seeing this kind of this technology change, and for me, it started to look like we would be able to get to this place where we could start to build machines that would read and understand language to a reasonable degree, but more than that, they'd also be able to generate language. They'd be able to write, and once you've got these two sides of reading and writing, you're able to kind of start to replicate a lot of human behaviors, and that are currently very, very important for large organizations. And so coming out of that, it was a chance to get back into this world of geopolitics, government intelligence, and insurgencies. And so one of the places where there's a huge amount of reading and writing is inside the government intelligence space.
Sure.
We have tens of thousands of analysts sitting down and reading and trying to understand what's going on in the world. And so that was a really, really interesting place to come back and apply this technology to start to generate that first draft of the kinds of reports that analysts would be making. And if you can build technology to do that, well, firstly, you start to see things that are very, very interesting as they unfold in the world. You start to see patterns again, but also more importantly, you free up a lot of analyst time to go on and figure out the so whats and the what ifs.
Sure. Interesting. So I'm curious then, how do you, or like, what do you guys kind of do now with this technology that you've kind of developed? Because it's actually quite fascinating, especially with all the stuff that's kind of going on right now. I think obviously a lot of people right now, the big thing is the fake news kind of stuff that, all these companies are either having issues with or trying to stop. But how do you guys kind of handle all that stuff with your technology?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So the first thing is there's a sense of you're trying to grasp a sense of reality, right? And truth is a really important, thing that we have to get in the world. But there's two things that kind of run at that. One is the complexity of the world that we're in, right? There's a huge amount of things that are going on, and even if we are seeing what we would deem to be an or non-manipulated reality, there's no guarantee that we can still understand it, right? So complexity is an issue that we as humans run up against.
Sure.
And the second bit is the stories that we tell about reality. And some of these stories can be manipulative. And indeed, any kind of story is a degree of manipulation, whether it's trying to simplify things for us or whether it's trying to simplify things for someone else's benefit.
Sure.
Any story that we tell is a simplification of the world. And these can either be useful or they can be exploitative.
Right.
And one of the things that you come through that is, ultimately, I think you're trying to build stories that are useful. Now, there's a lot of actors out there that have a vested interest in telling you stories that are different. So there's two things that kind of come through that. One is the first is we went into the space in 2015. You don't sort of get into the space of understanding Russian and Chinese language as they describe the world that's going on without being acutely aware that not everything that comes from Pravda is real, correct, and truthful.
Sure.
So there's definitely a sense. There's not a surprise here, right? But what do you do about this as it comes through? Well, there's a couple of things that emerge. First and foremost, things that are kind of fake, as in totally made up, never happened, are actually pretty rare. This is actually not the vast majority. Like most of the things that are absolutely fake are small and relatively a small volume of the total pieces of manipulative information. What's much more significant is the things that are real, but probably aren't as important or aren't as significant. And so you can tell almost for anything you want because of the sort of the state space of the world that we're in. You can tell a story that's real, that's rooted in something that happened, that takes your perspective and point and reinforces it, underscores it, right? So it's not a question of making something up. It's finding an example that suits your narrative that you need and then telling a story around it. And because we have so much complexity, any kind of projection of that down to a simple story can probably hold any kind of worldview that you want. So this is actually a much more difficult problem. Is not to say is this real or fake, but is to say is this an accurate representation of reality, albeit a simpler one. So going through that, one of the things that we do a lot here is look at all the different stories that are being told and all the different relationships that are inferred from that, by all the events that are happening in the world. And so every time something happens, you get different pieces of information. They can be different stories. They can be transcripts. They can be images that will start to infer that something happened. And then you'll get the stories that we tell about that on top of it. So there's two sort of pieces to this. There's the reality and then the stories about reality. And you want to be able to separate those two out to start to infer the significance of the event that actually unfolded.
Interesting. Okay. So maybe this is a little bit kind of offside, but I'm curious about, because you mentioned different languages. Is sometimes part of the reason that some of the stories get so skewed when they get translated into different languages that just the translation maybe gets kind of lost a little bit? Do you know what I'm trying to get at there?
Yeah, so different languages are fascinating to look at. We live in an English, you and I live in an English-centric world, and we kind of think that the English stories that we tell, are kind of the important ones, right? And, if there was a story that happened in Russia, it would come across, right? We'd pick it up.
Sure.
The truth is much, much different. What we find is that half of all the stories that happen in Russia don't have a corollary in English. They just don't have a translation.
Oh, interesting.
So it's really interesting. So the transmission of information is actually pretty low. Now, the second argument as well, all the important stuff comes across, right? So don't worry. well, that's not even true, right? There's a lot of important things that happen that just don't make their way across. And it's almost, it feels somewhat random in terms of what information tends to make it into the English language space. So that's even without that's even with kind of humans translating that, right? Now, if you put machines on top of this, machines will sort of pick up different things, and the meaning can be very, very, very different, particularly with some subtleties in the way that things emerge. But the hard part is not can you translate it, but it's what do you translate. So if I said to go and translate everything in Russian and bring it across, you'd still be left with a question of well, what's actually important. And so the transmission of information between languages is lossy, and then the translation of an individual piece of information between languages loses nuance. And you can look at some stuff, and there's certainly been improvements with some of the consumer translation tools. But I think if you spend any time with that, particularly in geopolitical context, you can definitely infer the wrong meaning very, very easily from the translation that's automatically been done. So we work exclusively in the language that the information was written in, and so when we work in Chinese, we work in Chinese, and if you want to interact with it as a non-Chinese speaker, it's only at the final layer do we translate, but all the reading and writing is done in Chinese.
Got you. Yeah. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. So how does this kind of AI, machine learning kind of stuff that you guys are doing translate into the enterprise? Because you guys have some huge clients that people have heard of, and you don't need to obviously give away any kind of secret stuff that you guys are doing for them, but just overall, how does what you guys are doing at Primer kind of tie into kind of big organizations and big kind of data sets?
Yeah, so when we started with the intelligence community, we found that was a pretty representative problem.
Sure.
You have thousands and thousands of people, processing huge amounts of information, and the challenge was how do you figure out what's important? How do you
Sure.
figure out what's important inside of it? And if you think about this as a sort of a meta problem, lots of different information and what really matters. And of course, that translates very, very well into the corporate environment where you have some of these, mega companies, the likes of Walmart and even the big financial institutions like GIC that
Sure.
have huge amounts of money and people working for them. Similar kinds of problems. They sit there and there's just huge amounts of information that they have to kind of make sense of, and a lot of it, they're producing themselves. So we were able to go in and deploy our technology on top of their data to replicate the kinds of behaviors that their human analysts are doing on top of that. And again, once you've got the components of reading and writing, you've got a lot of flexibility, whether it's reading, PDFs or it's reading, regulatory documents or it's reading internal CRM or emails. You've got a huge amount of flexibility to deploy that on what's ultimately text. And then as you look to understand that, the systems can surface, the information that's valuable and interesting, and it's trained and tuned by the people inside of that organization to match the needs of the insights that they want.
Okay, interesting. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's actually quite fascinating that you guys can do this, because you guys, well, like, obviously it's not even comparison to how fast you guys can do this compared to like a human being, right? Like what you guys are doing probably within a matter of seconds would take a team of people probably months. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, speed is obviously a major advantage that machines have over humans. To sort of draw the comparison that humans will process one piece of information in about 650 milliseconds, and that's one piece
Wow.
of data. So if you're getting to 2 bits of information, it'll take you 1.2 seconds. And when we scale that up, it means if you as a human are kind of reading a 10K filing at 130 pages, that's 3 hours of your day gone, right?
Sure.
That's your 3 hours. Whereas machines can be trained to replicate that behavior, and of course, not just do one, but do thousands of them in seconds. Now, where machines, win is speed and scale. Where humans tend to win is precision. What that means is that humans, tend to be much more precise in the things that they think are interesting, and so that can be up into the high 90s. Whereas machines will lose a few percentage points on precision.
Sure.
What's interesting with speed and scale is you can pick up a massive boost on machines when it comes to recall, so picking up things that humans otherwise would have missed. And it turns out that humans are pretty bad at knowing what we don't know. We're pretty good at looking at the things that we do know and assessing a quality, which is precision. We're pretty bad at knowing the things we don't know, and the thing on that is that we tend to overestimate our ability of recall. So we tend to think we're a lot better than we are, and it's always funny putting the software on top of data sets, and for people that are whose job it is to look at these and understand them. And we'll surface up, interesting piece of information. The software will surface up interesting piece of information, and start explaining them back to the humans. The humans who spend the time with the data will look at this and say that can't be true. I would have seen that. There's no way I would have missed that. And that just kind of indicates how, I think how much we tend to overestimate our abilities. Of actually going through and picking up, on the recall side of the equation.
Interesting. So when you say surface up, does that mean I set a bunch of kind of keywords, and or is it kind of like a live search, or how does that kind of work?
So we take an example, and we'll talk at a sort of a somewhat generic example,
sure,
and keep it at that level. If we walk through and say, look, we're going to take all of the earnings transcripts, right, and all the earnings calls, and so let's say there's a universe of 5,000 that you're interested in, right, 5,000 earning calls this year, and you want to take every quarter. Going backwards in time. So you've got 100,000 earnings calls, right?
Okay.
That would then kind of go through and say, well, we're looking. We've got a training set of everything that we've previously picked up that are talking about a specific action that the company's going to take, right? And so, like, we've picked that up by humans, and we're fairly confident that's a good test set. What we can go through and go into that and say, look, given the things that we've found here, are there any other examples of this from earnings calls that are also these kinds of events? And so, it can go through and look on that. Now, that'll put back a test set with the performance on the model, and then what we can actually go through and utilize things like active learning and also weak supervision inside of the interface for the user to go through and quickly improve that performance of that model. So what they end up with is a system that has replicated the finding of these events that are given from the people inside of the earnings calls. So not only that, but they've also been able to kind of build a model that estimates the probability of these things actually happening in the future, which actually goes a lot way beyond the individual humans, because the humans can identify it and say, someone says we're going to do X. Well, did they actually do X? And if you're only looking at a small sample set of that, it's really hard to infer from the language whether or not X was actually, going to happen. But when you look at a very, very large sample set, not only can you identify the cases when people signaled that they were going to do X, they actually, can infer the probability of that happening as well. So that's sort of one example, and that would be utilizing, what we call weak supervision and active learning. But you can also go fully unsupervised, which is just, if you took that same data set and of earnings, transcripts and said, what seems to be interesting here? And the computer's, actually trained to look for latent structure inside of that data set and say, I don't really know exactly what this is, but here's my description of it, and here's why I think it's interesting. And it might, surface back 10 or 20 different things, which can be very, very, useful for the human users to come in and go, yeah, look, some of these are really interesting. I need to take a closer look. And so you can use different methods depending on the training data and depending on the engagement with humans into these systems, or you can go fully unsupervised, which allows you to surface things without necessarily even having a question at heart.
Okay, interesting. So how much of the stuff that you need to do to analyze this stuff needs to be kind of in text? Like you mentioned PDF, but if I scan in kind of paper documents, audio, video, can you guys analyze all that kind of, kind of old school kind of documentation where, it wasn't obviously converted to some sort of digital format other than maybe like a scan?
Yeah, so actually we've partnered with a couple of very good technology groups on OCR, and so we've got that capability, which is great. We don't build the OCR capabilities ourselves, but actually there's a bunch certainly on the intelligence side of the equation where things are picked up in handwritten notes, and that's an important data point. The second, we take text and we'll actually deploy from speech to text, and so we bring that through. Okay. And we do analysis of images and videos, and
very cool.
That's often related to the text as well. So if there's an event that unfolds that we identify, we can see the event and describe the event. But we can also look for any images, that are likely pertaining to that event, and then actually go through and connect those events to the story connect those images to the story that's being told. And so, that's a really, really interesting piece, is that, if things are referring to a particular person, or they're referring to a set of numbers, if there's a chart that looks like it's pertaining to those numbers, you can surface that as well. So, yeah, what we would sort of say on this is that the different pieces or streams of information, are all useful. And I think as we move to a world with more data, you want to be able to take the diversity of that data and assemble it together to shine a brighter light on what's actually happening.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to me. So I'm curious then, we talked a bit about kind of enterprise, but when we first kind of connected and I kind of was doing some research on you guys, it kind of came up about being able to kind of get computers to actually write stories or news stories or kind of anything at some point. Like I've had people on the show where they're building stuff to write product descriptions, right? And then maybe a human has to go back and actually, make sure that product description is pretty accurate. But you basically, or give me your thoughts on kind of computers writing different content for kind of good and potentially really bad things, right? Because I think it was like WhatsApp in some country was getting bad press lately for, spreading fake news and people were getting killed, which is like obviously super sad. But so how can we kind of talk about your thoughts on kind of actually using computers to kind of actually write or put things out there that, seem real?
Yeah. Well, look, one thing coming out of this, I think it's a good thing to acknowledge. It's easier to train a computer to write something that's fake than it is to train it to write something that's real.
Okay. Why is that?
The reason for that, the reason for that is if you think about describing the world, or describing a part of the world even, or just a small thing, there's only one sort of, space of that where it's true. There's an almost infinite space where that's false, right? Okay. So if you think about just the kind of, the probability that if you were randomly generating sentences, the probability that you hit one that was true is much, much smaller than the probability that you hit one that's false. So easier to write something false than it is to write something that's true.
Interesting.
Just on sheer kind of probability space. Secondly, on that, that assumes you know what true is. And oftentimes you don't actually know what true is. So even if you're building systems to generate text, knowing what you should actually be writing about is half of the problem. The other half being able to express it. So when you see some of these things, right, where you'll be able to take a bunch of things like scene done, the transcripts from Friends over the course of their all the sitcom Friends over all the series, and they'll generate something that's somewhat plausible. They're not bad. If you cherry pick maybe the best 10%, maybe they could be maybe they could pass for a scene. But it's not true, right? Like that's just a story,
right?
Similarly, we've seen some of the team in here has built, just for test sets, we're built on restaurant reviews, right? And we can build, a text generation output that will, give you a wonderful review of like, the local kind of, dive bar or Chinese restaurant. But it's not true, right?
Sure.
It's not clear that it even serves that food. Now, you can constrain it somewhat, but again, like, it might say that the Kung Pao chicken is terrible, and it might be wonderful, right? So
sure.
Again, it's easy to build things that sound true. It's harder to build things that are. Now, if you want to build things that are true, you have to constrain every claim that's made to some ground truth, right? And that's where you lose some of that flexibility and freedom. If you think of these models that are trained, on observing a large number of corpus, what they're really trained to do is to use language that's being similarly used in the corpus around them. So they're quite good at sounding real.
Okay.
Where the constraint comes in is you have to keep all the different relationships. So if we go into the world of geopolitics, if you build a system, that says, Russia bombed, China, that would be very, very different from building a system or building a sentence that said China bombed Russia, right? So it may sound equally right, but the consequences of generating that are obviously massive if you get that wrong. So the point there is you have to constrain it to reality. And to that extent, you have to have a map and a sense of what reality is. And that's sort of the big challenge of language generation. Dealing with the thing. That's why I think we're going to see much more of it, being used for the pushing of fake news and propaganda and things that are more manipulative. I think it's a tool that is definitely easier to deploy in those spaces. However, if you've got all these systems, computers generating information that's meant to manipulate, and you don't have any tools to read those, as a human, you're just going to be bombarded with a huge deluge of information, of which, is generated by machines that may be targeted to you that you don't have any tools to navigate. So even though it's easier to deploy these to generate fake information, the easier it is to do that, the bigger and bigger the need to have these tools to read that information and to tell you a story that's closer to reality. Now, outside of the intelligence context, we see this a lot. If you go and take, in the finance space, and you take a set of relatively poorly covered companies, so maybe get your way down the Russell 2000 index. Okay. They don't necessarily have huge numbers of analysts covering them. They aren't, your major kind of brands. You may or may not have heard of these companies. If you look for information online about them, you'll see up to half of all the information being computer generated. And so we're already in that space in the financial things. And these are pretty crude things, although they're improving. But you'll read through them and, maybe maybe you don't as a human. The thing there is when you train machines, the machines pick this up, straight away and say, this has all been generated by machines, just FYI. That becomes a very, very interesting thing for machines to kind of recognize other machines. But this is already kind of happening in certain kind of spheres like finance,
okay.
Where you're probably getting some pretty sophisticated language generation, although I'd sort of say that most of it is kind of rule-based or template-orientated rather than being of the next kind of generation of neural nets.
Okay, so could some of that data then, say in this finance space, be used to pretty accurately predict certain outcomes?
Well, how do you mean, like coming through and saying if you, yeah, go on.
Like, I guess, like, can you predict if I should buy stock in a company that's maybe traded, that's maybe not as popular, based on kind of data you pull from maybe that company and kind of online? Are we there yet?
Yeah. So let's go to a couple of things. So firstly, there's obviously a huge industry of quants that are predicting,
Sure.
And fairly successfully. They're mostly using numeric information. So text is kind of the next frontier. And
Sure.
text is an interesting thing, right? Because you're going in and language is a little more complex than numbers.
Sure.
Now, a lot of the stuff that is done, I would say, in terms of what's commercial today, is things like sentiment, and there are, I think, reasonable trading models that include sentiment
Sure.
inside of them. Coming deeper than that, in terms of looking at language, I think you unfold event-driven trading strategies.
Okay.
But it's not clear that that's going to lead to certain events that happen that you're looking and monitoring for. That may or may not be encoded already into kind of price information,
Okay.
particularly the emergence of tail end risk. So things that are relatively infrequent, but if you can monitor enough things, you can start to observe them, and then that they're not encoded. The second bit is looking at the connectivity, so events that happen that are not connected directly or mentioning the company involved, but you have a priori model of how the two things are connected, so that you see the event unfold and no one's connected it back to the company and the stock. And you're able to make that connection as it goes through. So there's some interesting stuff there, but I think the stuff that you sort of maybe alluded to from the previous part of the conversation was, once you have machine generating stories, you have obviously abilities to start to influence. Now, the regulatory environments, preclude that from happening to some degree. It's definitely, I think we're going to see the edges of that pushed. Where we don't see it is in the crypto space.
Yeah,
and so
interesting.
where most of the kind of things coming through is you're getting these machine generated stories about, the crypto things and ads that are being, automatically generated to push. And that's sort of the Wild West. And I think in a purely unregulated space, you could see huge manipulations on sort of, I guess, pseudo futures and these kind of ICOs, which you have stories being written and pushing and moving through that. So there's some degree of control in the US markets on that.
Okay.
I think in the crypto space, you're seeing probably a very, very happy hunting ground for a lot of language generating stories. A lot of language generating engines to write stories to manipulate.
Interesting.
Thanks for listening to Building the Future. This show is heard by more than 1 million people monthly in over 15 markets worldwide, including Silicon Valley. Kevin Horick's guests are leading business owners, successful entrepreneurs, and merchandisers worldwide. Now, your brand has an opportunity to tap into this dedicated and active group of business people who are looking for places to invest and the right opportunities to support. Find out how you can get involved at buildingthefutureshow.com.
Well, and I think the other thing that I was kind of thinking about, and we were kind of talking about it before you got on the call, is what about, you could almost write, like if you're launching, say, a startup, from today we launch a startup, could you potentially have some data and some text and some other things get created and just start flooding the internet with kind of maybe half-truth at best things based on what's happening kind of in the world, to actually get your startup to cover or talk about how to solve some problems that are kind of happening in kind of right today and then tomorrow, and weeks and months going on, that like I could have something actually writing content based on what's exactly happening, based on maybe hashtags that are trending or things that are trending online, to kind of help me boost my company and or startup to actually move forward and actually gain traction and potentially become really successful. Do you know what I'm getting at there?
Yeah,
or is that kind of crazy?
That's right. It's sort of the scary future of things. I mean, if you substitute startup for ICO, then I think we're probably not too far from it.
Okay.
I think coming back to kind of what's actually being done today, one of the places that I love looking at it is these Amazon stores, that'll be, taking, T-shirts and coffee mugs and so on and printing sort of slogans on them. And these slogans will be just generated. And they'll be, obnoxious or strange or weird or random. They're generated by machines. And then they'll hit one, right? And they'll hit a really good phrase on a T-shirt, keep calm and X, right? And they hit it, right? And then everyone starts buying it. And all of a sudden, they keep producing more and more of it. So there's this kind of thing of, searching the space to see, what's going to hit. And when it hits, doubling down again. Sure. And if you do this, you could do it for descriptions of products that didn't exist and get them, into the kind of the likes of Kickstarter. You could make icons that, had never occurred before. And the issue on that is it's easy to generate lots of things. It's hard to know which ones are successful. But if you're doing this at scale, you can effectively A/B test everything. Sure. And if you A/B test everything, you only need to be right once. And when you're right once, you go for it. So I think we are seeing this stuff today. I think the next level of sophistication is not slogans or sort of, crypto coins. They would be going into kind of, potentially political manifestos, right? Generating the story, and you go, instead of just trying to intuit, like Donald Trump trying to intuit the popularism, just have a machine, figure out what's most popular and start making that the platform. And we saw that with, the 5 Star Group down in Italy, these populist political movements. Why are we trusting humans to kind of come up with, the popularist message? If you really want to push that, A/B test the hell out of it and run. So I think there's some really interesting things here when you think about the capability of machines to generate language and sort of by proxy kind of products or ideas or things at scale. And then we have a testing mechanism back against us. So we're right on the edge of that, right? And I think where we have been, and we look at the political manipulation in the last election, it's pretty primitive. It's pretty rudimentary. It's people sitting down largely and scheduling messages that they've pre-created themselves. And to the extent that there's automation there, it's fairly crude and it's not really A/B tested. But all of that now exists, right? The science to do all of that exists. And so we will see that creep into the political space and probably in time for the midterms here in the US.
Sure. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on how do we as human beings inform ourselves or try to figure out the actual most amount of truth to something you read online, because it's always going to be skewed some way, but how do we kind of look for and detect kind of fake news?
Yeah, also, so I'd say on this here, if you want to go fake, like things that never actually happened,
sure,
that are fake, then I think you're looking at this, 3 or 4 things that we would come through on this. The first is provenance. Where did this information first come from? Okay, and that tends to be a very, very issue. And it's not like, where was the article published? It's like if they're making a claim, that there were 600 people arrested, sure, where did that first originate from, right? Sure. The second bit kind of coming from that is, what, and it's kind of related, is what degree of independence of the sources. So you want multiple perspectives. Okay. So that could be it could be a video from one source. It could be an interview with a person on the ground from another source. It could be a third one is just an account from from maybe the one of the leaders or the police side of it, right? So multiple accounts from different sources that are not regurgitating the same information. So there's sort of an entropy metric that you want to take. The third piece of this is the claim that's being made. What's the distance? When you think of an entity graph of all the different relationships that exist, if a claim is being made, how big is that jump connecting those two entities? Okay. And if that jump is very large on that graph, then it is less likely to have occurred. Now, it doesn't mean it's fake, But it probably means there's more evidence, because the priors on that are that this is an unusual connection to make. And so you can kind of think about, the Hillary Clinton and child trafficking. The jump on that graph to make that connectivity, Hillary Clinton is a child trafficker, is a big jump.
Sure.
And not just a big jump, metaphorically, it's actually literally a big jump on that graph.
Sure.
So if you connect that, you better have a lot of evidence to do so. So the dynamic there, I think, when you start looking at that, the third bit, or I guess the fourth bit on that is, once this information out, how is it propagating? And real information that's not manipulative has a dispersion mechanism through our social networks, through mainstream media, that has one characteristic. It looks a certain way. Media that is being pushed, whether it's real or fake, but let's say fake media that's being pushed and manipulative, has another characteristic. And so the diffusion of that tends to be a lot more tightly bound by groups of actors that are much more highly connected than the organic fashion, and that's because of the way that these networks are constructed. And so looking not necessarily at the content, but looking at how the content propagates is also a very, very good signal amongst this. And so I think these are tools that start to give us evidence of things being real or fake, and manipulative or not. But I would caveat that and say this is by far and away not the dominant form of manipulation. The dominant form of manipulation is something actually happened, and we're going to amplify that much more than the significance that event would actually warrant. So similar mechanisms, but you're just starting from something that was real, and so it's harder to say, hey, that never happened, it's fake, because evidently it's real. It's just that it's being used to manipulate.
Sure. I'm curious. This is what I do personally, and tell me if it's good or bad. I like in the political space, if I'm trying to follow some sort of political story or candidate or whatever, I'll read kind of hypothetically say like a Republican type news source, and then I'll go read a Democrat type news source on the same story, for example, and then I try to read something that doesn't really have a political affiliation, and then I try to piece it together and form my own kind of conclusion on what potentially happened there. Is that kind of a terrible way to do that? Is that a good way to do that, or is there a better way to do that?
No. So I think so. Look, the systems that we build and deploy, we'll run through and say, look, something happened. There's an event here.
Okay.
Here's the most central perspective that we can find.
Okay.
And that won't necessarily be in one article, right? That
Sure.
may be an aggregation of information from different things. The nice thing is when you have 20 or 30 pieces of this, you can actually assemble that back together to get a very good kind of mean approximation to what's going on.
Gotcha.
Once you go through that, then you're looking not just for a left or a right, but you're looking for variances in how the story's told, right? And I think humans as sort of shortcuts will look for the maybe the Breitbart article or the Mother Jones article, or we'll take those proxies, but those perspectives could very well be captured in all sorts of different sources. But you're looking for variances in that and saying, look, there's actually 3-4 stories going on here. This event happened, but there's 3 or 4 stories, and here's how we would tell each of those stories back to the user. And then secondly, it's saying and this information that is being broadcast to these other perspectives first was seen in these publications, right?
Okay, interesting.
And that's where you get the not just the left and the right, but you get the variance of opinions or perspectives, and you also get the provenance of those. And I think the bit that the humans will struggle with on that is that's a pretty time intensive way of doing that. So
Sure.
for anything that happens in the world, you want to be able to call it up, and our software allows that to be automated,
Gotcha.
so that the user is flagged with that. And I think the piece of this again is that's actually a very good strategy. It's just quite as you describe it from a human perspective, it's quite expensive.
Sure. So Are you guys ever going to build your own kind of like consumer version of your software, or how would that even work?
Yeah, so it's been something we've been experimenting with. Here I think of just, we all sort of, we all built the techniques, for our government and our corporate customers. And
sure,
the advantage of that is, obviously they've got deeper pockets and can pay for kind of some of the expensive development that's going on.
Sure.
But we all, everyone here at Primer will run some variant of this on their own cell phones. Looking at the part of the world that they're interested in. And for me, I spend a lot of time running this on top of scientific papers. And,
sure.
And that's that allows me to kind of navigate the changing landscape of AI and quickly kind of understand what's going on. But we'll have people running this on all sorts of things. And so as we come through that, I think there's a definite path there into a more generalizable consumer application. The challenges on that are scaling these algorithms up to literally hundreds of millions of people.
Sure.
And, that's one issue. I think the second is you want to refine the outputs and performance of these. The consumers have a different kind of tolerance in terms of their engagement. But as we come through this, I think there'll be a few things later this year that we'll experiment with publicly, and that'll be really fun. And I think be very, very interesting to see how that goes, and then we'll go from there. So this is I think very, very interesting technology, and the wider we can get it in the hands of more and more people, I think the better that will be. So excited to get that underway.
Yeah, because I think the interesting thing that I could see happening is if I want to know something about something, whether it's happening today or it happened like 100 years ago, and if I can just like almost have access to that information that's as truthful as possible instantly or within a matter of seconds or minutes, it is actually like really cool, right? Or potentially really cool and powerful.
It's a game changer, and it sort of takes us through, and my philosophy on this is that the sort of the base level of knowledge in the world that's assembled together by a lot of human reading and writing can and should be automated, and so that we as humans can stand on a little higher rung on the ladder, and make use of that machine intelligence to help us understand that base layer, and stand a little higher, and do things that are more interesting, more creative. And I think if you've got some of that in your pocket, then all of a sudden you've got a more accurate rendering of how the world is, and you can go from there and hopefully make some better decisions. As the world we started off, as the world becomes more complex, we absolutely need these tools. We're not going to do this with our human brains alone.
Sure.
We need to help the machines that see the world differently and can do things that we simply can't do.
Sure. But sadly, Sean, we're out of time. So let's close the show with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself and Primer.
So you can go to our website, primer.ai, and you can jump in there and take a look at some of the technical blog posts we've put together. You can also go and have a look at some of the visualizations of the technology at work, and you can go and also take a look at some of the coverage, and hopefully link to this podcast there as well.
Yeah, that I will definitely put all that in the show notes. Well, Sean, I really appreciate you taking the time into your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day, man.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com, and keep building the future.